and welcome to episode 202, all about the queer community and the Lord of the Rings fandom, being the 202nd part of That's What I'm Tolkien About. Hello, my name is Mary Clay. If that's too complicated for you, just call me MC. I've been experiencing the world of Tolkien for the first time, and right now I'm doing whatever I want to, including talking about queer readings of Lord of the Rings, talking about queerness in the fandom, and all of the wonderful things that come with that. Joining me today are Alicia and Grace of Queer Lodgings. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
I was so pleased that Twitter recommended y'all's podcast for me to follow, because I was like, this is great. Why has no one made a Tolkien podcast called Queer Lodgings yet? And you guys did it. So
well, it's like
I'm very proud of you.
The only good thing Twitter's ever done.
Right? Yeah, we were talking a little before we recorded, but why don't you well, first, let's talk about your origin stories with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. How did you both come to find this zany, wacky man and his world?
I read The Lord of the Rings the first time when I was a freshman in high school. It was right before the movies came out because I'm ancient. I had this obsessive crush on a teacher. His name was Mr. Van Wyck. And now he dropped out of teaching.
Was he an English teacher by any chance?
He was a journalism teacher, so adjacent.
Okay,
that counts.
Close.
Yeah,
that counts. It's either your English teacher or your art
words.
teacher for us queer kids. So
that's fair. So he doesn't teach anymore. He actually makes artisanal bespoke knives, which is a strange shift. But I annoyed this man every day after school, and eventually he was like, "Look, I see where you are in your life right now, and what you really need to do is you need to read this book in particular, and you need to read it right now because they're about to make a movie and it's going to ruin it." And I went home and I binged Lord of the Rings in a single weekend, and I've been hooked ever since.
You read Lord of the Rings in a single weekend?
Yeah, if you want to really be impressed, I read the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire over a week and a half. So
see, that I've decided to not even touch Game of Thrones.
That's fair.
Reading granted, I took over a year and a half to read Lord of the Rings because I was doing it for this stupid podcast. But over a weekend, that's insane. I'm sorry. I keep it. Continue.
I disagree with him. I do also like the movies a lot. I don't think they ruined the book at all. However, reading Lord of the Rings first is terrible if you're going to go back and then read The Hobbit. Because The Hobbit is so simplistic and the style is so different. I honestly dislike The Hobbit as a book. Which is funny because most of the times I've been published, it's been on The Hobbit.
See, I also read Lord of the Rings first, and then I read The Hobbit. I really love The Hobbit because I love the whimsy, and I love how lighthearted and whatever it is, and it's just like a walk in the park compared to just, trudging through Mordor.
Tra-la-la-lolly down in the valley.
Oh, it's great. There's so much. There's singing. There's riddle games, and it's not that serious. It's not that serious. Let's just go on a quest and defeat a dragon.
Very different vibes between the two of them.
Yes, yeah. Grace, how about you? How were you introduced to Tolkien?
So I read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings when I was a teenager and got into it. I was kind of inspired to read it because my best friend was reading them in Boston and I was living in New York, and it was a thing that we could talk about on our epically long phone calls and stuff like that. But I was familiar with them from a very young age because I grew up in a very strange town in upstate New York that's a small farming and artist community with a ton of celebrities who also have weekend homes there.
Interesting.
And so Romeo Muller, who wrote all of those Rankin Bass Christmas specials and everything like that, and also wrote the teleplay for the animated animated Hobbit film and Return of the King film, lived in town. He was our Santa Claus, actually. Like, he had written those, and so I grew up also knowing, like, these books and films and adaptation. And I wasn't allowed to see the movie until after I'd read the book, but I knew of Romeo's involvement with it. And so I became this huge Lord of the Rings fan. I wallpapered my room in page-a-day Lord of the Rings calendars. I was absolutely ridiculous. I had hand-colored maps of Middle-earth that I had posted on my walls and everything, too. And then just kind of like kept that excitement, sort of like the coals banked on it throughout college and like grad school and all of that. I didn't have a lot of people around who like really enjoyed Lord of the Rings or anything. They weren't really familiar with it. A lot of folks hadn't even seen the movies, which shocked me because I'd seen them, 200 times and whatever. And then fairly recently, while I was dealing with a pretty awful like online abuse situation, friends of mine who were part of the Mythopoeic Society invited me to come and check that out. It's like the oldest Tolkien society in America. And through that, I ended up getting involved with the Mythopoeic Society and am now a steward, as is Alicia.
We tricked you.
You all roped me in a vulnerable time with beautiful talk of Tolkien gardens and
to be fair, that's what happened to me too.
That's how they get you.
And through that is how I ended up meeting Alicia and the other folks on our Queer Lodgings podcast.
Awesome. Wonderful origin stories, I think is the phrase I used. And then why don't you tell us how or what it is you do on Queer Lodgings, the things you talk about. How did you start that? How did you come to it takes a lot of energy to make a podcast. So how did you say to one another, let's do this?
Yeah, it was interesting because it came from spite. I was increasingly angry with the tenor of the discourse in Tolkien fan spaces, specifically on Twitter. There's a large problematic group of people that I have been discussing with a small group of people on a Discord server and getting progressively more and more angry about people talking about how, queer people don't belong in Tolkien fan spaces at all, whether they're saying that directly or not. And eventually I was thinking about all the Tolkien podcasts that are out there, and they, none of them are run by people like us. So, like, what ended up happening is I'm angry, and we were at MythCon, which is the Mythopoeic Society's annual summer conference, and I got to talking to Grace, and I was like, "Hey, Grace, what do you think about let's maybe do a podcast?" And I also ended up approaching Leah because Leah was part of that space where we all just grouse about how terrible people are. And we got together and really honed what our message was. And that was really a group effort. Because I was like, look, I know that we are all queer people, but what is really our differentiators? And Grace and Leah really helped push us in the direction that we currently are going.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is neat to note about our podcast title is that it's very tied to a lot of history and tradition within the Tolkien space as well. You are familiar with it, I'm sure, as one of the chapters in Fellowship of the Ring, Queer Lodgings, Beorn, which is the chapter that's this like beautiful space of rest and reprieve in a world that has brought a lot of attacks to those characters. And they have this moment to, sit among the bees and enjoy honey, and Gandalf blows rainbow smoke rings, and it's just absolutely lovely. This little rest and reprieve while they're like pursuing this important quest and this important task. But it's also the title of one of the sort of seminal or premier papers about queer studies in the Tolkien space back in, I think, 1999 is when that Queer Lodgings paper was published. So with those two pieces in mind, that's why we chose the name Queer Lodgings for our podcast.
And my God, have we gotten so much pushback about it.
We did.
That's how you know you're doing it right.
We did put the word queer next to the word Tolkien in the internet age. And yeah, we do see some interesting takes as a result.
Yeah. Well, thank you both and the rest of the folks that you guys do the podcast with for taking up space in this community to be authentic, to discuss these things that are important to you. It is Pride Month. It is what one of my friends called it, like the month of our Lord Pride. In the month of our Lord Pride, that was it. That was something that. And also, I think very timely because I think it's a human rights campaign declared that there's a national emergency state of threat for LGBT plus Americans. So it's important that I am someone who I have friends who have described me as tragically heterosexual. So I just try my best to be an ally, to listen, to amplify voices of people within my community. I have the platform to do that. Okay. And we're going to celebrate this beautiful part of the Lord of the Rings Tolkien fandom and community because there is so much value to be added. So even though there are all these really terrible people out there, and I think it's also so easy to think that this is how the majority of people are and this is what everyone is like, but I think it's those most hateful people that are often the loudest, and it can be hard to remember that there are nice people in the world and in our communities. So that's just really awesome that even though it started from a place of, experiencing negativity, you're able to bring positivity through it and also a little bit of spite. We love that. We're fueled by it.
That's one of the key things too of being queer people in this internet age. Like, we see a lot of hate and anger and vitriol online every time we turn on our computers, every time we look at our phones. We see it in person. We live under oppressive laws a lot of the times, and we can either let that grind us down, or we can turn that into fuel for our creativity and take that frustration and spite and make beautiful things with it instead. So that's kind of what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, as Leah pointed out, we all have Virgo kind of central in our astrological charts, and therefore we need to tell people they're wrong in excruciating detail. Mm-hmm. And a podcast is the perfect long form content to do that in.
Yes, I'm going to tell you you're wrong, and I'm going to cite my sources while I do it.
That is our vibe. Yes.
So let's dive into. That was all some very heavy, deep stuff that I went into. So we'll hopefully have a little more levity and lightheartedness going forward. I say that, and then the first thing that I was going to ask for y'all to share, if you feel comfortable, is what is it like to be a queer fan? And also, again, I am an ally, so please correct me if I'm using any terminology that y'all don't feel comfortable or if y'all feel is outdated and inappropriate. But as queer fans, if that's what you identify as, what is that like? Is it something that you're able to connect with others? Has it felt isolating at times? Explain that for people like me who are maybe clueless about what it's like to exist in these spaces.
Yeah. And I want to start out by saying there are a handful of really lovely, progressive, queer-led, queer-affirming spaces in the Tolkien fandom. And there are some wonderful Tolkien societies and all of that.
We should shout some of those people out, like Alliance of Artem. They are kind of the premier group of, allies and leftists, if I can say that, in the Tolkien fan spaces. There's also a number of really left and queer friendly Facebook groups if you are an old and on Facebook.
That's awesome.
And then the Tolkien Society and the Mythopoeic Society are both formal, not-for-profit Tolkien societies that are really putting their thumb on the scales to try to have a lot more content and a lot more recognition of different types of diversity and progressive stances and progressive undertakings in looking at Tolkien scholarship and fandom and all of that. So those are lovely things that exist. But at the same time, that's not the bulk of where we are as a Tolkien fandom space at this point in time. The daily refrain that you will hear is Tolkien was a Catholic, and so he would hate XYZ about you specifically. Like, he wouldn't like that you're queer. He wouldn't have liked queer people. He wouldn't want you to be here. He wouldn't want people like you in Middle Earth. That none of that is something that's okay to be in the Tolkien space. And so there's rightly a lot of pushback against that. And I'm going to plug one of our next upcoming podcast episode. We're currently doing a Queer Lodgings podcast series called Tolkien Would Hate This Podcast.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought that up because it was in my notes to bring up. I just listened to that first episode today because I get a lot of the same comments with the stuff that I post and produce of Tolkien would hate this and all this stuff. And my response is usually, I don't care.
Hey,
I'm not Tolkien. So what does it matter?
And he has passed these 50 years and we keep moving on.
Yeah.
So keep standing there in allyship. That is fantastic. Our next episode in that series is going to address Tolkien and sexuality and what he thought about queer people. And we're going to dig into some of the queer friends that he had in his life and all of that. So if you ever need to be able to refute bigots on that, definitely check out that episode and our, 31 pages of citations because we are who we are.
And also, what I loved in particular about how you guys were framing that, you opened it with being like, well, Tolkien would hate probably everything anyone in the Lord of the Rings fandom is doing. He would hate probably all of us. The end. Okay, good night. Thanks for listening to our podcast. Because it is so true that, he would probably disapprove of
I don't think Tolkien would have been
we're all doing.
Particularly pleased with the technology of cassette tapes, let alone podcasts. So,
yeah. Oh my gosh.
As we look at things through this sort of historical lens, we have to take it all with a grain of salt.
Yeah, there's so many letters where he is, one, telling people that he can't believe that they're wasting space talking about him. Like, he specifically talks to somebody who wants to write a master's thesis on him. And he's like, no, that's dumb. Why would you do that?
Yeah.
On top of
Meanwhile,
the fact,
I've spent the last 4 years doing this podcast.
Right. On top of the fact that he just, dislikes Americans in general, it seems. It's one of the things that keep coming up, that the American fans in particular are cultish.
I think once a country publishes an unauthorized version of your books, I think it's hard to turn that relationship around,
Yeah. And we talk in there too, possibly one of the reasons that Tolkien expressed exasperation with American fans is that the American fans were not always cognizant of the time zone differences between the US and the UK. And so when they did ring up his private residence at 2 a.m, he was somewhat less forgiving in those letters and following days.
Yes, I can imagine that would be the case. Absolutely.
So.
Anyway, so this episode that y'all do in this series that y'all are beginning, even though we can easily brush it aside and say Tolkien would hate all of us, the end, goodbye, you do still say well, we really don't know. We don't know what he was. A very complex man. At the time, he was writing, I would say a lot of what he wrote was very revolutionary in terms of how we just looking at I did 2 episodes about masculinity in these works, and that was very these representations that he's writing of all of these heroes and main characters is very was very non-traditional at the time. So we don't know what he would think in today's world if he had adapted through all these technological changes and ideology changes. And he's a human being. And a lot of times as fans, fans forget that he is a multifaceted human being. Maybe he would be an extreme homophobe, in which case maybe it's good he's dead.
Spoiler alert for that episode.
But again, I always like to conclude that conversation by saying, well, I'm glad Tolkien didn't live long enough to see Twitter. That's how I feel about that.
I'm glad Tolkien didn't live long enough to potentially pull a J.K. Rowling.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think the thing for us to keep in mind as modern day fans too is whenever we look at an author or historical figure and, you know, are trying to think of what they would think now and trying to implement that lens. First off, we're never going to be completely accurate. They've passed and we can't ask them. Short of a Ouija board, we're out of luck. But we as people living in the modern age can always seek to not be reductive of what they believed at the time that they were living. So certainly any of these views that take things that Tolkien expressed not being judgmental about and try to impose that as a limitation on who belongs in Middle-earth, there's no need for that. That's not doing him justice either.
Yeah, a lot of people have a tendency to look at specifically like queer and racial issues as well, although that's not something I'm really poised to be able to talk about as a white person. But they just, as if queer people didn't exist before the 60s, as if Black people didn't exist in England in the Middle Ages. Like, a lot of people really want to see The Lord of the Rings as what they consider their utopia, which is white, Christian, cishet, although they would be upset that I referred to it as cishet.
That common argument that we probably all see, that Tolkien was writing a mythology of Europe. And so that's why there can't be any XYZ type people. And it's like, those people were also in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Very much so.
Yeah, it gets draining having to like be confronted with that all the time. I am the social media steward of the Mythopoeic Society, and part of what I do is I moderate all of our social media spaces to keep them as safe as possible for everyone. And I see a lot of that I really don't want to see outside of the area where we all go to laugh at people being dumb. I still have to like wade through all of it and moderate it in a way that doesn't make some members of our board angry, because we have a spectrum of, you know, political beliefs on our board, and some people think that it should be free speech all the time no matter what. Even if that speech hurts other people. And I don't believe that, and I'm the one who moderates. So to a certain extent, I get to do what I want, but sometimes I have to beg forgiveness.
Yeah, that's difficult. Those are like difficult waters to be in. Which is why I like running my social media where I just have to worry about me. And I'm like, this person seems truly vile. I am blocking them unashamedly.
That's something for us all to keep in mind as fans in different spaces too. Like, when we're having a good fan experience, when we're able to say, oh, I haven't seen that negative thing crop up, that's almost exclusively these days because someone is doing that moderation work, and people are making sure that those spaces remain welcoming for a broad variety of people. So sometimes the absence of seeing some of the things that marginalized communities deal with all the time is because there's already been a lot of good work and support done.
Yeah, it's not because it's just magically not happening anymore.
Yeah. Excellent. Yes. Excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. So as queer fans, and as, you know, you've been doing more series and episodes of your podcast, are there any particular themes or characters, moments, you know, those types of things that stand out? If there's something that's maybe like queer coded that someone like me wouldn't pick up on, something that like stands out that maybe you identify with or that you find empowering or inspiring.
I think one of my favorite examples of that, where, you know, some people might overlook it or it might mean something different to folks from different backgrounds, is is actually something that came in the filming of the Lord of the Rings movies, and something that Sir Ian McKellen said and made sure was included in Peter Jackson's films. There's a moment after Mount Doom when Frodo is going to survive and they're recovering, that Sam is there and they clasp hands, and it's this moment of joy and finding each other again and all of that. And Sir Ian McKellen, I believe it took Sean Astin aside and reminded him that that was a very significant moment for a number of different types of fans, not least queer fans, who were going to be looking for that connection, that it was going to be incredibly meaningful, and to make sure that there were takes that included that moment. I think that's one of the things that could easily be overlooked by cis-het straight directors and actors and all of that, is how those, whether friendly or romantic or queer platonic connections that mean so much to so many people might not resonate the same way for everyone, even though they would be meaningful to everyone. They just take on different layers of meaning in different communities.
That's so beautiful. I don't think I knew that that happened in the filming process. That's legitimately so wonderful and beautiful. And also, first of all, we have Sir Ian McKellen, who is Gandalf the gay. We have, which, by the way, I did not know that he was gay until, I think over a year into this podcast. And there was some behind the scenes footage of the hobbits talking about, oh yeah, well, one day Ian took us to a gay nightclub, and I was like, wait, what? And then I was like, no, this makes sense, because I've definitely seen, articles and pictures of him at prides and his activism and stuff. And I'm like, why did I not connect those dots? Okay. And then also, I almost said Sam Astin. Sean Astin has also, in recent years, come out as a big Frodo-Sam shipper, saying they should have kissed. I support it.
Go back and shoot that.
Yeah.
Please.
They're too old. They're too old now.
I disagree.
Frodo is technically 56.
We all have iPhones now. They can manifest this.
Because Sam and Frodo meet up again in the Undying Lands. Give me that.
Let's see some, epilogue, prologue stuff happening in the Undying Lands.
Listen, they never really filmed the Scouring of the Shire. There's a lot to go back and check out.
In the middle of taking down, this oppressive society that Saruman has set up, they just make out real quick in the middle of it. No big deal.
Just real quick. just as a
just
treat.
Real quick smooch.
Sam and Frodo are kind of like baby's first ship in a way. Like a lot of people do them specifically as a queer ship. I do want to point out that Frodo is a pretty interesting character, because Frodo is read multiple ways, right? He could be read as gay, he can be read as polyamorous, he can be read as on the ace spectrum somewhere, as can Bilbo himself. And I think that ace representation is something that gets kind of glossed over a lot when people are talking about queer readings, because they're like, oh, well, they're bachelors, and the assumption there being, oh, they're straight, they just never got married, and
never found the right person.
Yeah, that's not necessarily what's happening there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think Bilbo being ace representation is a really amazing headcanon and a way to view his character, because he lived such a adventurous and long and happy, fulfilling life, despite the fact that he is not, partnered up with someone. And so that says to people that you don't have to be with another person romantically to live happily ever after. You can find these ways of fulfilling outside of that.
And he builds this beautiful found family. He names Frodo as his heir. He like creates this wonderful space in Bag End that is welcoming and affirming. And then Frodo, Alicia mentions polyamory and all of that. Sam marries Rosie and they both move in with Frodo in Bag End at the end, which is something that a lot of folks don't recall happens. It happens, you know, in sort of a note in passing, and it's not something that's usually in filmed adaptations or what have you, but it's really huge. And you know, Frodo is creating this space in the same tradition as what Bilbo did. There's some excellent papers that are just beginning to be presented at different Tolkien seminars and everything in this past year that are absolutely phenomenal in regards to the queer space and found family that is Bag End.
I do also want to throw out that, you know, maybe Bilbo never married because his one true love died.
Yeah, that's possible.
Yeah, Bag and Shield, very popular ship.
I believe that Bag and Shield is the most popular Tolkien ship on all of AO3 by a factor of like 10. Like fully half the fics are Bag and Shield.
I wasn't sure how to look up all of that in like a smart statistical way. I knew if I like just typed in. Yeah, so let's start talking about ships. We've had some like deep, intense conversation now. Let's just have fun and talk about ships, and some of these have very silly names.
Yeah. One thing I want to preface this with, by the way, though, is that as we're talking about these various ships and taking these queer readings and all of that, they're additive, right? Just because you can have one headcanon doesn't mean that you can't have another one that means something different. So like I can absolutely read Frodo and Sam as beautiful, wonderful boyfriends, and, you know, with that dynamic with Rosie and everything too. I can read Sam as a bisexual babe and also read Frodo as ace, and also see that level of just like queer platonic partnership, or where they're deep and abiding friends that's maybe the way that it would have been received in like in earlier decades and all of that. You can hold all of those ideas simultaneously. And so when we can ship all of these things alongside each other, no one's excluded.
Yes, I love to, this is what I just get so furious about all the time with so many arguments on the internet and stuff, is that two things can be true at once. You like things can be happening, like it, just because like one person ships Frodo and Sam doesn't invalidate any other readings or interpretations of that. That doesn't mean that you can't also, I personally go back and forth all the time between shipping them and then viewing them as just friends, because I think it's also so healthy to have a strong, close, affectionate male friendship that isn't romantic. I think that's like equally as important. But both of those things can exist in the universe. They don't mean that one is not true.
I think it's also really important to recognize that because of what is seen as normative in our society, those deep and abiding friendships are a queering of the norm, whether there's a sexual or romantic element to them. They're outside of the norm. And so as we're reading and taking these different like fan receptions and readings and all of that, they're outside of the norm, and that's part of the point of how Tolkien was writing them.
Yes, excellently put. So we already talked a bit about Frodo and Sam. Alicia, you said Bag and Shield. I was on Tumblr from the years 2010 onward. So I had seen the ship name Bag and Shield be thrown around a lot and being like, what is that even? And then wasn't introduced to it until obviously reading The Hobbit. And reading The Hobbit, I'm like, this makes no sense. Thorin like literally hates Bilbo. They like barely interact.
It's a movie ship, man.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a movie ship, and it's a movie ship that I didn't get until the scene where Thorin is dying. And then later on, and then Bilbo saying like, getting choked up, being like, he was a fr. And like, he can't even say he was my friend. He says like, he was more than a friend. And I'm still very confused by it, because Thorin just seems like I'm not a big fan of Thorin, I should say. So I just don't like that
he's a
he's
mopey
so
little
mean.
guy. Yeah.
Yeah, Bag and Shield is a huge ship within the fandom that is so interesting to me that it came out from the movies, which are also controversial within the fandom.
I think
Leah is
a
currently
lot of
sending us Bag and Shield gifts on Discord right now. It's like she knows.
She can it's like a spider sense, but with this ship.
So
oh, by the way, when I was I wanted to pull up like a list of all the ships because I'm like, there's a billion characters. There's probably stuff in here that I don't know about. So I just Google searched ships in Tolkien, and it just came up with a list of literal ships, like boats. Like there's an entire Tolkien Wikipedia entry for all the boat names. Anyway,
you can read it very literally, or you can read the subtext. You know, it's all there.
So, in my opinion, the scene that launched Bag and Shield is on top of the Carrack when Thorin is like, "You never should have come. This was a mistake. Oh, I'm so happy." And they hug. And there's that swell of music. I think that's what launched a lot of people's ships there, personally.
I think Richard Armitage's eyes, just as an experience, are
I was
responsible for a great deal of the popularity of Bag and Shield. Yeah.
Yeah, like you can't like not want to ship him with someone. And a lot of times I think ships are like a self-insert kind of a thing of being like, well, I can't be with Thorin, so I'm gonna ship Bilbo with him. Like, I can't be with this person, so I'm gonna ship these two characters that I like together so that maybe he's fictional, but maybe in their fictional universe they'll be happy together.
Well, so many people love that hate to love dynamic too, right? As
someone who during Rings of Power season 1 was very pro Galadriel, Halbrand / spoiler alert, Sauron, and is still pro Galadriel Sauron. I get it. It's that enemies to lovers thing. It's like crack. It's addicting.
Well, if you like that enemies to lovers sort of thing, there is another Sauron ship that you should be aware of. It's a little bit more insidious, and this is silver gifting. So Sauron,
it's my favorite.
Sauron disguises himself in a number of different forms. He takes on different fair forms and fair voice, right? Throughout, the first and second ages. By the time we get to the third age in Lord of the Rings, he's lost that power. He's lost that ability. He's been shattered too many times to take on fair form, let alone form again, really. But back in the first and second age, he can go around, making himself look sort of however he wants. And one of the guises that he takes on is that of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, who comes to the Smiths of Eregion and offers them all this aid that he claims he's an emissary of the Valar, and he can help them with their knowledge and their works, and that he sort of like has everything that they might want, right? Tolkien uses a lot of very interesting words to talk about Sauron's deception here. He talks about seduction and beguiling and how Sauron ensnares the Smiths of Eregion. There's this element of deception, but using language that has a very traditionally like sexual or romantic element to it that belies this other type of connection. And so, I mean, we have him going around talking about how, Sauron as Anatar seduces Celebrimbor and the Smiths of Eregion, and seduces Ar-Pharazôn in Numenor and all of that. And a fairly popular ship is that Anatar and Celebrimbor moment, because, Sauron, like, it's unclear if he knows how much deception is he trying to deceive himself too, which is definitely something that the Rings of Power folks are teasing out with the Galadriel moments also, like how much Sauron is trying to deceive himself alongside everyone else. And then, spoiler alert for where Rings of Power is going, that dynamic isn't going to go well. There's going to be a sort of toxic X thing going on.
Sauron does kidnap Celebrimbor.
He makes him into Celebrim Banner.
Let's find out.
There's just, like a really toxic X moment. Is that like Taylor Swift's got nothing on that, But in this long time period in the Second Age in particular, there's a lot of space for fan readings and fan interpretations that that look at what had the potential to be a really beautiful or a really dark dynamic, and a lot of space to play in that sandbox. So that one is a ship that is pretty popular, especially among Silmarillion fans.
Super interesting. I have not ever heard of that ship, but I can see how, because Sauron has like these seductive qualities, I can see how that would happen within the fandom. Similar in that, like, well, not that time frame. This would have been, I don't know, hundreds of years, whatever. Time is irrelevant in this universe. One that I laughed so much, but I see it. Feanor and Melkor, and their ship name is Feanope. Which just made me laugh so much, because I think that's another very similar enemies to lovers thing, a like hate loving thing. They're only attracted to each other out of spite, that kind of a thing. And also they're like, reading the Silmarillion, it mentions all the time that they're both obsessed with each other. So that one kind of makes sense to me. Also, just Feanope just makes me laugh, because it's like, nope, this isn't going to work out. This isn't going to go well.
God, in a similar vein, one of my other favorite ships is Angband, which is, it's Melkor and Sauron in Angband.
Oh, okay. I didn't know what their ship name was, but I had that written down too.
I want to be very clear that Tolkien is very clear that Melkor seduces Sauron.
Yes.
Like, this is what Tolkien writes. And he talks about this as like the first, like the sort of like the blueprint seduction that Sauron then follows the pattern of in, confusing people and seducing people and creating the rings and all of that. Like it's a pattern, a cyclical pattern that plays out across the ages of Middle Earth. But these are the actual words that Tolkien uses to talk about these things, which is why there is a lot of like really great, really well-researched fanfic and headcanons and all of that for Silmarillion characters and all of that. It is absolutely phenomenal, the levels at which a lot of fans know the material and can look at the spaces and gaps in between.
Yo, fanfic writers be out here like penning entire great American novels, but you just don't even know it because they're using already existing worlds and characters, and I'm over here like trying to string two sentences together, like trying to remember what even happened in the Silmarillion.
And, Tolkien fanfic will run the gamut from your more traditional type fanfics that are, quick and fun and fluffy, to things where, the appendices at the end of the fic are almost as long as the 30,000 word fic, because it is all that well researched and documented. And that's something that's kind of special to Tolkien fandom, is that just that level of showing love for the source material by how much you've researched it and how much you're connecting it to all of these other pieces.
Like, specifically, there are Silmarillion fanfic writers who have read more of the history of Middle-earth than I have, and I do Tolkien scholarship.
Yeah.
That, like, if you're gonna dig into a 12-volume, incredibly, like, reference-heavy set of books to write a fic, you are going above and beyond.
It's dedication, yeah.
Slight correction, Alicia. It's actually 13 volumes. One entire volume of the same size is the index of the 12-volume series.
I mean, if you're gonna count,
it's on the wall behind me.
And see, this is why I have people asking, aren't you gonna do the history of Middle Earth? No.
The first two are, like, relatively easy to read, the Book of Lost Tales, and there is good stuff in there, like his concept of Numenor as like a mechanized world and that kind of stuff. It's interesting, his time travel stuff, but I mean, so much of it is just there'll be like 3 lines of text, and then Christopher's going on a page and a half about where this was in his father's stack of papers and other things that could potentially like interact with these 2 lines of text.
Talk about dedication.
It's rough to get through. And Christopher was a gift to us.
Yeah. A gift and also maybe a curse to the fandom that we have this much to work with.
I think one of the things that's really cool for fans and, you know, fan writers and fan artists and everything like that is because Christopher did so much work to document the conflicting versions of what J.R.R. Tolkien wrote and the ways that the stories evolved and all of that, it sort of sets up the ability to look at this through this entire world through different lenses and different headcanons, and that there's space to understand things in a variety of ways. And so it makes for a very rich environment for people who are reading or writing or creating in that space.
Yeah, definitely. Another Silmarillion ship. We've said a lot of we've said exclusively male ships because I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the world of Tolkien is almost overflowing with men. Not that many women. I don't think you can even. I'm sure there are people that ship, you know, Éowyn and Arwen. You can't ship Arwen and Galadriel because they are related.
Correct.
Please do not ship them. And I guess unless that's your thing, but it's definitely not mine. But like those characters barely interact, so there's not much to go off of. But one that I really like is Galadriel and Melian because they're homies. They're homies. And it's the Silmarillion mentions so many times that like Galadriel confides in Melian or goes to her for advice, or that they seek each other's counsel. And I can see a like close relationship growing out of that.
Absolutely. Galadriel Melian is one of my favorite ships between the women. We actually, in our podcast, one of the first episodes that we did was going through close readings of Galadriel and queer readings of Galadriel. And I definitely want to circle back around to her because there's some trans readings of Galadriel that are really cool also. But
yeah, we can definitely.
One of my favorite things about Galadriel and Melian is how Melian and Galadriel's dynamic was originally introduced in some of Tolkien's earlier drafts. He famously has a lot of different ideas about, you know, what type of elf Celeborn was, and, you know, at what point Galadriel came to Middle-earth from Valinor, and what things she had done along the way. But there is a passage in this is actually in History of Middle-earth that talks about Galadriel and Melian with a couple of key phrases. One is that there was much love between them, and that Galadriel received the love of Melian. And that first line, that there was much love between them, is very, very interesting, because in the published text, that line still appears, but it's instead applied to Galadriel's relationship with Celeborn, who she is married to. And in the original draft text, it was Melian. And so that gives us a lot of fun things to read.
Yes, yeah. That she is capable of loving two people in the same romantic way, that it's the same type of love.
Yes, or that it was transferable, and Tolkien eventually like puts this into the published text in relation to Celeborn, but we can certainly read that type of love then back to Galadriel and Melian, which is very fun.
Yes. You know what else is, I don't know how to transition to this next ship because I just have a bunch of question marks after it. I'm assuming it also came from the Hobbit movies. Thranduil and Bard.
Yeah, that's...
Do y'all know anything about this one?
That is definitely a movie ship.
Because I don't even think they speak. to each other?
I would say that most likely, like, I'm going to take a sort of external reading on that, that is us as fans looking at the fact that the Hobbit movies, for all the challenges that they have in some of the CGI and plot elements of in adaptation, had a lot more queer cast members. And I think that that's really, like, folks as fans taking a look at like screen time that is very briefly shared between queer cast members and looking for what the ship might be there, and being able to read subtext and all of that there, and in ways that I don't know that I would find that same support in the text if I were reading The Hobbit myself. Yeah. But there's a lot of expansion in those movies, and I think that created space for more queer representation and more queer reading. Personally, I ship Thranduil with Celeborn because Celeborn goes off and hangs out with Thranduil in Mirkwood at the end of Lord of the Rings and doesn't sail to Valinor with his wife. So,
that's right.
You know, she sails with
Gandalf. Which, my God, Ian McKellen and Cate Blanchett's chemistry in all of those movies. How can you not ship Gandalf and Galadriel? How can you not?
I don't think I personally do, so I guess that's how.
Oh my God.
If Alicia got to be queen for a day, we all would, though.
Yeah.
Man, that one scene in The Hobbit where they're standing in the little council area and the sun is rising and she's holding his hands and then, like, she ends up disappearing. Like, how can... Oh.
Yeah. I was very...
And, like...
Not to go into, like, the Hobbit movie territory, but I was very confused by what they were doing or implying with their relationship in those films. It was very confusing for me. Anyway, also... I think maybe this, what did I say, Thranduil and Bard ship came out just because Lee Pace is good looking and Luke Evans is good looking. And in this movie, they're both good look. Thranduil is another, as I understand it, gay icon. So,
yeah. For better or worse.
Maybe it's just...
At the time of filming, they weren't necessarily out as actors. But in the days since, there's some of the at least 4 male actors from the Hobbit films who have come out as
I mean, to be fair,
queer.
some of them came out because Ian McKellen accidentally outed some of them.
Yeah,
oh, no.
Ian McKellen tried to he was having a lovely interview and he was talking about how affirming it was that there were so many queer cast members on set. And I think he ended up citing a number and then people tried to work back from there as to who that would be. And that in particular, that ended up with Lee Pace having to come out when he wasn't out to his parents yet. And that certainly was not Sir Ian McKellen's purpose, but
yeah,
maybe we'll chalk that up to him being a older gentleman now and maybe not.
I think he was just excited and wasn't thinking about, because think about how queer culture is now and how acceptable it is to be queer versus when he was coming out. I'm sure he just was like, oh, this is fine, and this
is great.
But
there
the most recent person who came out
probably
was Thorin.
Yep.
Yeah, was Richard Armitage. Oh, yeah. He just publicly
this is
came
all
out.
news to me.
He
good
publicly
for them.
came out in an interview. He talked about his partner with he/him pronouns, and then was sort of the interviewer or subsequent interviewer sort of wanted to drill down on it.
It was recent.
Yeah, and
this was April. Wow.
Yeah. And his response to oh, is this you coming out or whatever, was a very sort of delightfully British statement that I came out at 19 to everyone who mattered. And really setting up this expectation of privacy, even though being out in his personal life and everything, it wasn't something that he was out in his professional life, which is a good reminder that, you know, queer people may be out in different facets of their life or with different facets of their identity, right? So, you know, sometimes we're out as queer, but like are still working through maybe like what our gender identity is and what have you. So people may have coming out journeys throughout their lives, and it may sort of circle around a bit. So.
It's for everyone, it's always an evolving thing as we grow and learn more about the world and about ourselves and how we and like what our place in the world is and like how we are interacting with others. It's always going to be something that's constantly evolving. Literally just yesterday, I was looking at Magic the Gathering card of Goldberry.
Oh yeah.
And
she's
everyone's calling her Thickberry. Yes.
She's so
and
gorgeous.
I was like, am I attracted to a Magic the Gathering card?
You are, and you're valid.
Yeah. She reminds me so much of the Breath of the Wild Great Fairies. I cosplay one of them.
Yes!
She looks like Kotera, and that's who
Discord
I cosplay.
server.
And I'm like, shit, do I have to cosplay Goldberry now?
Yes. Love it. And also just, I had a moment of like, her body looks like my body.
Yes.
This is really wonderful to see.
Yes. One of the Galadriel cards for that set was just spoiled as well. And, you know, some of them have that sort of like what you would expect an elf woman to look like.
Yeah.
And some of them are like a little bit more body positive and a little bit more like, I'm like, ooh, hello also.
Oh, I love it. Love it. I literally have never given Magic the Gathering one thought. And then this Lord of the Rings set is coming out, and like just the art alone is so amazing and validating for so many different fans of so many different identities. It's really, really wonderful to see a part of like the fantasy genre, like claiming acceptance and openness and welcomeness.
Yes. And they're aware of some of those queer readings and everything too. There are some Frodo and Sam cards that there's a dynamic in the game called like basically like partnership. They can pair up and be stronger together or whatever. And Frodo and Sam have that dynamic in some of the iterations of their cards. And my also queer husband will just every day at this point is bringing me beautiful queer and progressive moments from those cards as they're starting to be revealed. And it's just very exciting.
Cool. So we're all going to start playing Magic the Gathering. Everyone come back next week. We'll play a round. Is that how it works? I don't know. And then I would just be remiss if I didn't at least bring up Gimli and Legolas.
Giggles.
Yes, Giggles.
I don't normally go out for the sort of portmanteau names for my fandoms that have existed more than 10 years, but that one's a fun one. And I love them so much.
We love them. This is another one that I kind of equally, I love the idea of shipping them romantically, but I also I value how powerful just their platonic friendship is, just because like it means so much in universe, just the mere idea of a friendship between an elf and a dwarf. But then sometimes it's like, but how platonic is it if Legolas took Gimli with him to the Undying Lands?
Yeah. Also, we actually just tweeted about this because it's something that I will never shut up about. But you know how Gimli has that whole thing about the glittering caves near Helm's Deep?
Yes.
And all that, right? And under the White Mountains. And he's just so like impressed to be able to see them, and he wants to share that with Legolas. And they make this agreement that they will travel. They'll go to the glittering caves. They'll go to Fangorn. Like they will travel together as companions and all of that. That is where Tolkien took Edith on their honeymoon.
Oh!
The glittering caves are based on Cheddar Gorge, and that is where Tolkien honeymooned. There is a very emotionally resonant piece there that, even if you're reading that as on a friendship level or whatever, it's this like romantic friendship.
Still something that
there's a honeymoon happening there.
Had a romantic connection.
Yes.
Like, wow.
Yes.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, he actually, and he discloses that in a letter that he wrote in 1970, that's where he had honeymooned. And it was in his mind when he was writing because he had visited there again in the 40s. But yeah, that's a honeymoon for me.
Wow. That's really great. Yeah, they totally went on a honeymoon together. Save the world, rest, recover, and then going on a honeymoon.
And also,
Absolutely.
like, they didn't just show up on a different ship. Like, they didn't, like, book passage with Galadriel and Gandalf and all of that. Like, they stay until Aragorn passes, and then Legolas builds his own boat for him and Gimli. Just the two of them.
Just
because they were roommates.
I love to see it. And they were roommates. Truly the origin of they were roommates.
That is one of my favorite, like, almost like near canonical Tolkien ships where there's a lot that you can read in from there. I do want to shout out another elf dwarf dynamic. Actually, a couple more.
I hope you're bringing up what I think you're going to bring up.
I think I'm going to go there for you, yeah. Let's see. But before that, I just want to point out that Celebrimbor and Narvi build those doors of Durin, like the doors to Moria that we encounter in Lord of the Rings, speak friend and enter and all that, and beautiful symbol of friendship. But, like, that's a pretty interesting dynamic that you can read some subtext into. And then in Rings of Power...
Yes!
We've got... Elrond and Durin. And we have Elrond and Durin and Disa, my beloved power throuple. I hate the word throuple, but they get to use it because they're so good.
It's so perfect. They did such a... I think for me, it's also just because I think, say what you will about Rings of Power, there were... everyone has their likes and dislikes about it. Mm-hmm. I think they did such a fantastic job with the dwarves and characterizing them and telling, like, their side of the story and Khazad-dûm and everything. And I feel like they really put a lot of love and attention, and the actor who plays Prince Durin as well. Mm-hmm. So, like, when you have that much care behind this character, and then, like, his chemistry with the Elrond actor, and, like, so they share so many little, like, side eyes and smirks, and they can still be so honest with each other. And
I love it because, like, Disa is right there. Disa is never really, like, removed from that narrative either, which is why I'm like, they are my power throuple. I absolutely adore them. There is so much wonderful content that we see on screen, and then so much storytelling space around that too. Like, I'm in love. They're my favorite ship from all of Rings of Power, and probably the one that I've written the most about. So
yeah. That's amazing. That's awesome. Yeah. The idea of, like, a throuple is something that I don't think I've ever, like, encountered in media enough to be like, oh yeah, I ship these three people together. Especially coming from like a monogamous mind.
Sure.
Imagining, like, well, how is it possible but seeing like the relationship between Disa and Durin, and then seeing this such strong connection between Elrond and Durin, and then seeing Elrond making an effort to connect with Disa, it all kind of, like, clicks together, and it's like, oh, they work together, and they truly are a power throuple.
Yeah, they're phenomenal.
Love to see it.
I do want to... We've already discussed Frodo, Sam, and Rosie as being a throuple. I also have a kind of mean ship for Frodo, Sam, and Gollum as a throuple. Very problematic throuple. But a throuple nonetheless.
That's another one of those toxic relationships, I think.
So
that doesn't end well.
Gollum and Sam gonna need a lot of counseling, need a lot of couples therapy if we're gonna make that one work. Maybe
they both care enough about Frodo that
my
they're
thought
willing
is
to make it work.
It's
definitely a hinge relationship, a
Yep.
V. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Rather than a triangle, it's just a V.
Exactly.
Yeah. And Frodo is the point. Yeah, I could maybe understand that working out possibly. Again, with therapy, I think you're right. Couples therapy, essential. Jumping now to the you brought up that there's a trans reading of Galadriel. I think that's super interesting, and I would love to hear about that, because we also shouldn't forget about the T in LGBT. especially because the trans community is so is hurting so much right now.
So very much under
least.
Fire. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So there are two really important trans readings that I want to make sure that we touch on. One for like a group of characters and one specifically for Galadriel. And for Galadriel, there's a lot of really fun things. She is described, particularly in like the Silmarillion, Histories of Middle-earth, Unfinished Tales, and everything, as having this sort of like Amazonian disposition and everything like that, right? Like she braids her hair at the crown of her head as she engages in athletic feats, and this is kind of why all of her names tend to, like all of her names later in life, at least, like Galadriel and all of that, tend to be relating to her hair and all of that. But the elves have this thing of you get sort of multiple names throughout your life. There's your mother name, which is the name that you're kind of given at birth. And there's a father name, which is supposed to be sort of like foresighted and all of that. And then other people may help you choose a name later in life as well. So Galadriel's mother name is Nerwin, which means man-maiden.
Wow.
And she definitely does a lot of things that are gender nonconforming, that are queering of gender roles throughout all of her different iterations in Tolkien's writing. And then as she gets to Middle-earth and Celeborn enters the picture and everything too, he's actually the one that ends up giving her the name that translates to Galadriel. And this is a pretty neat narrative considering that, you know, trans folks a lot of times will change their names later in life to like what their name that speaks to their actual identity is, as opposed to the name that they were assigned at birth. And so there's a lot of cool trans readings of Galadriel, specifically, both in terms of embodied gender roles and also naming conventions.
That's so I did not know that her original name, you know, her birth name was also Galadriel is just so much better than Nerwin. But that's so fast. Man means man, maiden.
Yep.
And then the fact that Galadriel means lady of light. It's not just like, oh, it means light. It literally is transitioning from man, meaning man, to meaning lady. That's so,
and then querying the definitions of both of those gendered terms, which are already in the context of Tolkien. Like the conceit of Tolkien's writing is that like this is a translation of like an Anglo-Saxon translation of like what the hobbits or the elves were writing in, right? So we have like multiple layers of translation, and the words that refer to elven genders are not, you know, there are actual words in, you know, Quenya and Sindarin and all that refer to gender for elves that are not necessarily directly mapped onto, you know, our perception of gender today in modern culture. So.
And my God, if we're going to mention Galadriel and trans readings, we got to just take a second to talk about Éowyn and how she's genderqueer.
Yeah, that's another one that also of like Éowyn being a queer icon as well. I think there's also like a joke in there that maybe I can't make about being a horse girl as well.
So like Éowyn and Galadriel, when you take Galadriel's entire story throughout the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales on through The Lord of the Rings, they're very similar stories. Like they both kind of, you're introduced to them being discontent. They go through a period of really heavily non-gender conforming and end up more closely gender conforming. Whereas, to speak of it in Anglo-Saxon terms, Galadriel ends up being a cupbearer, like someone who is there in court to give gifts to guests, which is, you know, a queen's job in Anglo-Saxon times. And Éowyn ends up being a peace weaver, essentially. She is married off to a neighboring ruler to ensure peace. And a lot of people read Éowyn as kind of a betrayal of feminism, because of she goes from being a warrior woman to marrying Faramir and settling down and wanting to focus on healing, which I think is a valid reading. But I don't think it's my reading, because when you look at the masculinity in Tolkien, so much of it is centered around healing. Because Aragorn, he is identified as the king by the fact that he can heal.
The healer, yeah.
I also just want to say Faramir has such strong I love my bisexual wife energy. And
this is
that
just
is super
another
valid.
reason why he is actually the best character in all of Lord of the Rings.
He's my favorite Lord of the Rings character, hands down.
Yeah.
And that's not just because I'm
Book
a bisexual
Faramir.
married to a man.
Yeah.
Book Faramir, 100%.
Yeah.
But I've been kind of writing a paper in my head about how queer Éowyn and Faramir's relationship actually is, and I'm gonna actually write it and present it at some point at some conference, because it's there and it needs to be talked about.
That's perfect. That's perfect. I love that. Yes. Finally, I think one point I want to bring up as well is that the Valar, who are the gods of this world, are neither man nor woman, and they take on the appearance that they like feel within themselves, and they perform that identity outwards, but they are not actually they are neither man nor, they are non-binary and decide to present one way or the other.
And they can change their physical form like clothes and put on a physical form that aligns to their conception of their gender. And that's very cool. It's certainly the more that we understand like the nuances of gender and the more conceptualizations we have of gender going forward, the more space there is for the really progressive readings of that, possibly more progressive than Tolkien even knew he was writing. And that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what it always comes down to with stuff like this, where we're like, oh, cool, Tolkien said trans rights. And it's like, probably not. But it's cool that he wrote this thing, and that now we are using this as like a foundation, a jumping off point to like have these imaginings, to have these discussions, to look at the world and the characters more critically.
Yeah.
And he kind of like coming full circle with this conversation. He is not alive to dispute any of that. So
yeah.
We'll carry on talking about these things as we continue to find meaning in them.
Yeah, I do want to point out that Yavanna often appeared in the form of a great tree. And if there is anything as non-binary as my gender is tree, come on.
Yeah. I love that. Well, thank you both for joining me. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, and then also sharing the more important work of informing me of these ships that I did not know about. Where can people find you on the internet?
You can find us on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, or on Zencaster, or we now have a website, which is queerlodgings.com. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter at queer_lodgings. And if you want to really, email us and talk about how much you like silver gifting, you can email us at queerlodgingspodcast@gmail.com.
We also have, in addition to the podcast coming out, the next episode and all of that, there are a few other places that you can find us and those overlaps of interest. We are pretty much all going to be presenting. Yeah, we are all going to be presenting at the Mythopoeic Society's online Midsummer Seminar, which is a fully online conference that is open to everyone from academics to fans, and the theme of this year's conference is Fantasy Goes to Hell. So you will be able to, if you register, you'll be able to hear us talking about everything from queer coding of devils in literature and media to Rings of Power reactions and unpacking the fandom spaces and how hell can be other people. And as well as some very interesting papers that we know are coming from some of our friends of our podcast who are going to be talking about like readings of Sauron and just some really interesting things that are going to be going on through that theme of fantasy goes to hell. And then we're also going to be doing a takeover of the Tolkien Truesday hashtag. So in the Hobbit calendar, the day is Truesday, TREWSDAY. And so the Tolkien Tuesday and Tolkien Truesday hashtags are every Tuesday there's a theme, and fans and academics and anybody in the community is welcome to share their thoughts on that theme and their joy for Tolkien's works through that hashtag. And the day before International Day of LGBT Pride, the June 27th, is when Queer Lodgings is going to be doing a takeover of the hashtag, and we'll have that theme be queer readings. So
all of that is awesome. Super exciting. I will leave links to all that in the episode description if you would like to go check it out. This is something that I waited too long to figure out what it was, and I missed the memo, and now I'm like, okay, I just have to ask, what is Tolkien Truesday? Yeah. Because I've seen the hashtag all over Twitter, and I'm just like, okay, it's just another thing for Tolkien Tuesday. But yeah, where did it stem from?
So it stems from Tim Bolton actually started organizing it in addition to the Tolkien Tuesday hashtag, which had been sort of just like Tuesday is a day to tweet about Tolkien, and that's neat.
That is the day that I release this podcast. I specifically picked Tuesdays as my release day for that reason.
And so the update to this with Tolkien Truesday is that in the similar vein to Folklore Thursdays as a hashtag, it's just that there's a sort of a prompt most weeks that everyone can follow and think of. Yeah, I'm always excited to talk about Tolkien, but this thing specifically, I want to talk about mountains this week. So we're going to talk about mountains, or we're going to talk about food. We're going to talk about water imagery in Tolkien. We're going to talk about trees, and it's just this sort of way that we can come together and have a sort of a conversation together, or be talking about similar things and examine that idea from a bunch of different facets and angles. So
got it. Cool.
You can usually get what the theme is going to be throughout the week beforehand, so you can be thinking about it and percolating. And even if you didn't, just check Twitter on Tuesdays and go ahead and jump on in. It's a really great, fun, positive Tolkien fan space to be in, and that inspiration, that little bit of sort of priming the pump with a theme really helps me be able to organize my thoughts, because otherwise I would I'd be all over the place going, I love this, and I get to be like, I love this thing specifically because.
Yeah. That's What I'm Tolkien About's cover art is by Vaishon Brandon. You can support him on Instagram at Vaishon Designs. You can get merch for That's What I'm Tolkien About by going to tpublic.com/user/TolkienAboutPod. You can follow the podcast on social media at TolkienAboutPod, and you can follow me on Twitter and TikTok at MCWhatsup, and on Instagram at MCTurndownForWhat. If you want to support the podcast, you can become a patron. Go to patreon.com/TolkienAboutPod to explore the levels of support that are available. As we are coming up on the final weeks of this podcast, every single person who has ever been a patron in the entire history of this podcast is so wonderful and kind. But especially our wonderful and kind person this week is John. John, thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast. It is so incredible that you would go out of your way to support something. Thank you so much. And one final thing that I wanted to touch on before we wrap things up that is quite serious and we should take seriously. As I mentioned in this episode, the Human Rights Campaign declared a national state of emergency for LGBTQ plus Americans. I will be leaving resources that the Human Rights Campaign has put together for anyone who is facing dangers and difficulties and possibly needs help. those resources will be there. And I will also be leaving a donate link for the Human Rights Campaign. I will be making a donation to help support and protect and stand up for the LGBTQ plus community, and I encourage you to do so as well. Thank you both for joining us. Happy Pride Month, everyone. Do you have any parting words for the audience?
Just happy Pride.
This is a lot of fun. Happy Pride, everyone.
Yay, happy Pride! And that's what I'm talking about.